Today I'm going to be focusing on two controversial issues that characterized Andrew Jackson's first term in office. One being the issue of Indian removal, and two, South Carolina's defiance of the federal government over the issue of tariffs. Perhaps the most controversial issue during the Jackson administration was the federal government's policy toward Native Americans. Now, during this time, there was still about 125,000 Native Americans still living east of the Mississippi River, with majority of these living in the South, making up what we sometimes refer to as the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles. And together, these 5 civilized tribes controlled millions of acres of land in what is today Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Of course, these 3 areas were also states at this time. And this is where the conflict begins. Is that during this time there was a big push to further settle these states, particularly in terms of establishing and expanding cotton plantations. Of course, with the Indians in this area controlling so much of this land that was now prized real estate, this is setting the stage for a renewed conflict between Native Americans and white settlers. So there's a lot of pressure to remove the Indians from this land in order to make room for expansion of plantation agriculture. This pressure is most intense in Georgia against the Cherokee Indians. Now, the Cherokees, among these 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees were probably the most advanced and the most well organized. And one of the reasons why these groups are referred to as the civilized tribes is that they, over the previous generation or so, there had been a big effort among these Indians to try and assimilate more fully into white society, especially among the Cherokees. Cherokees had gone to great lengths to adopt white ways in an attempt to assimilate into white culture, and this is for the purpose of being more fully accepted into society and reducing conflict. Kind of if you can't beat them, join them philosophy. Some of the things that they did, they took up farming instead of more traditional American-style farming as opposed to Native American traditions. They educated their children in American-style schools. Many of them had adopted Christianity, and they built churches and plantations. Some of them even owned slaves in their attempt to assimilate into white culture. One significant thing they did was that they created their own alphabet. A Cherokee Indian named Sequoyah went to great effort to create a Cherokee alphabet for the purpose of translating Cherokee language into English in order to teach their people how to read English. Because remember, Native American languages are spoken languages. They're not traditionally a written language. So basically, Sequoyah is inventing a written language from scratch, a written alphabet from scratch, in order to facilitate this translation and communication between Cherokee and English. So they've gone to a lot of effort to try to assimilate into white culture, but this is not going to make much difference in the end. Once Southerners realize the value of this land, and especially with the growing demand for cotton and the value and potential profits of the cotton plantations, these efforts of the Cherokee especially are going to go largely unnoticed, unacknowledged, especially in the state of Georgia. Georgia had passed numerous laws that basically denied Cherokee legal rights. They viewed the Cherokees as just tenants on Georgia land. They did not acknowledge the Indian sovereignty over their own land. The state of Georgia passed a lot of laws that violated Indian sovereignty, basically allowing white settlers to move onto Indian lands and begin settling. Basically, a lot of this Indian sovereignty was protected by federal treaties. Keep in mind, the Indians had signed their treaties with the federal government. So the state of Georgia is kind of taking its own initiative here and violating these treaties that the Indians have with the federal government. And this is where the problem really begins. President Jackson, at the time, he held very little concern for Native American issues. He openly encouraged the state of Georgia to continue in this manner, to escalate or increase its attempts to push the Cherokees off their land, and this kind of sets the stage for the Indian Removal Act in 1830. What ends up happening is that Jackson will encourage Congress to pass this law, this Indian Removal Act. Basically, what this Indian Removal Act will do is that it will allow or authorize the president to override the federal protection of Native Americans, basically to rewrite these federal treaties in order to facilitate resettlement of Indians west of the Mississippi River in what is today the state of Oklahoma. At the time, it was just a territory. So at any rate, this Indian Removal Act now authorizes the president to rewrite federal treaties, to renegotiate and these previous treaties in order to remove the Indians from their land. This is going to create a lot of problems in Georgia, especially where this resistance to this has become at crisis levels. The Indians, especially the Cherokees. Now, this is going to affect all the Indians in this region, but we're focusing the story on the Cherokees because what happens here is the best example of what's going on. The Cherokees will try to resist this in court. They will. There are two separate court cases. Will end up in the Supreme Court. One, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, and Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. And in these two Supreme Court cases, basically what the Supreme Court ruled was that individual states did not have the authority to pass laws that conflicted with federal treaties. So basically the federal treaty supersedes state law. So the state governments cannot pass a law that conflicts with federal treaties. The Supreme Court also went on to say that and this is John Marshall, still Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, went on to say that Indian nations are distinct, independent political communities. Basically, the Supreme Court here is acknowledging Indian sovereignty. You know, the fact that the federal government negotiated with these groups of Indians as independent sovereign peoples. You know, that's what acknowledged their status as independent peoples. They're not subjects of the state governments. They're not subjects of the federal government. They are independent sovereign people with whom our federal government had negotiated these treaties. Therefore, the state governments had no authority to act in violation of these treaties. So this is what the Supreme Court rules. This should be the definitive end or settlement of this issue, but it's not. Usually when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, that's the end of the story. Their word is final. They're the final say, the final authority on these types of issues, especially concerning federal law. But in this case, that's not going to happen. What happens is that when the Supreme Court makes this ruling that that state governments cannot interfere with these federal treaties, can't pass laws that violate these federal treaties, it's of little concern to the president and, of course, to many people, especially living in the South, because there's a lot of support for Indian removal. It's a very popular idea. Most of the Southern planters are eager to see the Indians removed. Andrew Jackson is also eager to see the Indians removed. So between, of course, the members of Congress who passed this Indian Removal Act, there's a lot of public and political support for this idea of Indian removal. So when the Supreme Court issues this ruling, it falls on deaf ears. No one really wants to hear this. So in fact, Andrew Jackson continues to encourage Georgia to take action to remove Indians, Cherokees, from their land. Jackson made a statement regarding the Supreme Court. Jackson said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Basically, he's just kind of openly, publicly defying the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't have any power to enforce anything. Jackson, of course, here is being sarcastic. The Supreme Court has no authority to enforce anything. They can make this ruling, they can make this declaration, but they can't really do anything about it. Jackson says we can do what we don't have to obey the Supreme Court. They don't have the authority to enforce anything, so we're just going to go ahead and do what we want to do here. And normally, if something like this happened today, where a president openly or publicly defied a ruling from the Supreme Court, it would probably bring a lot of public outcry. However, in this time, there's a lot of public support for removal of the Native Americans from their land. So no one gets angry at Andrew Jackson for making this public defiance of the Supreme Court. Congress doesn't get mad at Jackson because Congress is the one who passed this law in the first place. And of course, Congress, representing the interests of the states, again, there's a lot of public and political support for this, so no one really criticizes Jackson for his belligerent attitude toward the Supreme Court. So this process of Indian removal goes forward unopposed, despite the Supreme Court ruling, despite the Cherokee Indians seeking legal action. It's all of little consequence because of this widespread support. Even in the North, where there are no real significant Indian populations in the North, and no one in the North is going to benefit from this, there's still very little sympathy for the Indians, even from people who don't have a stake in the issue. So this is going to move forward virtually unopposed. And the process will begin in earnest in 1831 with what we refer to as the Trail of Tears. Now, the Trail of Tears refers specifically to the Cherokee experience in this process. But generally speaking, this same situation occurred across all of these tribes in the South, and to a lesser extent in the remaining tribes in the North as well. So Trail of Tears talks specifically about Cherokees, but we're going to use this to refer to all of these experiences because all these tribes experienced more or less the same sort of thing. And what we're talking about here is forced relocation of Indians mainly from places in the South to this Oklahoma Territory, which at the time had been designated by the federal government as Indian Territory. Land set aside just for the purpose of this Indian relocation. And it's currently, of course, on the current state of Oklahoma. At any rate, this experience is going to be a lot more tragic than the name of the law suggests. Indian removal sounds kind of innocuous. Federal resettlement of Indians sounds kind of sanitized and innocuous. But this is going to be a disaster, a cultural disaster for the people who will experience the reality of it. Basically, what we're talking about here is, of course, the Cherokee Indians primarily occupy this western portion of Georgia. Of course, we got the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, all spread out through this area of what is today Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Now, you can see here, of course, this vast territories of land here, millions of acres occupied by these various tribes. So you can see here why Southerners are going to be so anxious to get a hold of this land, because this is some of the most fertile cropland in the South is in these areas. And of course, cotton is a big money maker at the time, so there's a big attraction. There's a lot of support for this Indian removal. So again, while Trail of Tears refers to specifically to the Cherokee experience, all of these tribes are going to experience pretty much the same conditions, the same sort of situation, because they are all being removed and they're all being sent to the same place. So this Indian removal is going to take place over a period of several years. It's not all going to happen at once, not all overnight, but it will happen to all of these groups of people. Here we're looking at an artist's portrayal of the Trail of Tears, and we can see here that basically what's happening is that Indians were just told to pack up whatever they could carry and move out. And so they basically gave up all right to their land. They picked up what they could carry. Now some had horses, some Indian families had wagons, so the trip was not as harsh, but for the most part, these people are going to be walking for the 500 plus miles between Georgia and Oklahoma. This is not going to be an easy journey, and they're not going to get there in a couple of days. It's going to take several months for them to complete this journey. Here, the artist has portrayed a winter scene. If they don't, even if they left in middle of the summer, by the time they get to Oklahoma, it's going to be into the winter months. So it's the journey is going to be harsh. The conditions are harsh. A lot of people, as this artist is depicting, died along the way. In between 10 and 15,000 people are going to die en route. And this is, of course, not just among the Cherokees. This is among all the tribes. Total, about 10 to 15,000 people are going to die along the route. A lot of them from malnutrition, disease, exposure. Again, a lot of these people are not they're not equipped or outfitted to travel in harsh conditions. Some of them are old and are physically unable to make the journey. And of course, you'll see here too several soldiers portrayed in this illustration. This removal is going to be supervised by the U.S. Army. So this is not just the federal government or the state of Georgia insisting on the Indians leaving and waiting for them to leave on their own free will. The U.S. Army will forcibly remove these people from their homes and escort them physically to the frontier territory. So no one really has a choice here. They either have to go and leave or suffer the consequences. And the Indians here are not really in a situation where they can resist federal troops. Here's another artist's illustration of the same sort of conditions. We see, even though this is a different artist and this painting was done at a different time, we see a lot of the same elements. A lot of people walking, a lot of older people, some people, of course, kind of falling by the wayside, and we see the presence of soldiers escorting these people on their journey west. And while this is not a winter scene, the artist has painted these dark, gloomy clouds and rain, again symbolic of the suffering and the misery of these people. What's interesting to note here is that most of the representations of this Trail of Tears or Indian removal take place in recent years. Starting around the mid-20th century is the first time we really get any significant public sympathy toward the Indian community. Up until the mid-20th century, for the most part, Indians are represented in our history as savages and vicious brutes. They're not depicted favorably in the history books prior to the mid-20th century. So most of the artwork or these sympathetic portrayals of Native Americans don't even occur until more than a century after this incident takes place. Again, supporting the idea that as this event is taking place, as these people are being forcibly removed from their homes, no one really cares about what's happening to them. Southerners don't really care because they're eager to get a hold of the land. Northerners aren't really concerned because this issue doesn't really concern them. It has no impact on them. The only people who are really concerned are the Indians themselves, and American society as a whole has very little sympathy for these people. One of the reasons that it happened, and one of the reasons why it takes so long for society to look at this event for what it was. What's ironic about this story is that most of the information that we have in the historical record about what happened on this trail comes from the journals and the letters written by the soldiers who were escorting them. Indians did not keep a lot of records at the time. Again, for a large part, Indian society, their history is handed down through an oral tradition. So stories are told by one generation to the next generation, and that's how their history is handed down. Other than the Cherokees, none of these tribes maintained any kind of written language. So a lot of this history is just lost to stories of tradition. In terms of the historical record, most of what we know about what took place on this Trail of Tears comes from the letters and journals written by these military officers and soldiers who were responsible for escorting them. A lot of times, some of the letters that some of the soldiers wrote home describing these events expressed sympathy. The soldier was doing his duty, following orders, but he couldn't help but, as a human being, he couldn't help but notice that what was happening to these people was tragic, and he communicated this in his letters. Enough of these letters and journals survived, enabling historians to piece together the events of this Trail of Tears. So again, it takes place over several years in the sum total of about 40,000 Indians are going to be removed. So we started out with about 125,000 Indians living east of the Mississippi River prior to this Indian Removal Act, and in the end about 40,000 of them will be removed. So we're still not removing all of the Indians here. This is just a small portion of them. But among those 40,000, about 10 to 15,000 are going to die of malnutrition, exposure, and disease. Again, they were just not prepared or equipped for this type of situation. In the South, most Indians are going to comply with this because they're simply not in a position where they can resist federal authority. And very few exceptions. There will be very few exceptions of Indians resisting effectively. The one exception in the South is the Seminole Indians. And of course, in the north, around the Wisconsin and Michigan areas, the Black Hawk War, named after a chief in that area. The Sauk and the Fox tribes up in Wisconsin will actively try to resist this forced removal. And taking a look at our map again here. Again, this is up in the Wisconsin Territory, Illinois, and what will eventually be Iowa. This Black Hawk War, Chief Black Hawk tried to organize the Fox and the Sauk Indians to resist, to fight back against this federal removal. It ended tragically in the Battle of Bad Axe, which took place in 1832, when about 850 Indian warriors will attempt to resist federal troops who are trying to remove them, and local militias will be called up, and they'll attack the Indians who are resisting. In the end, about 500 men, women, and children are going to be killed as they attempt to flee across the Mississippi River in the face of federal troops and a local militia. And of course, here's an artist's depiction of that. Again, most of this artwork is done many years later, after public sentiment toward the Indians began to change. At the time, though, no one really cared about this, as Indians were being killed here in this resistance. Many people just saw this as the Indians getting what they deserved, because how dare they resist federal troops? This is our land, and we want it, and they need to go. So not a lot of people are going to have any sympathy for the Indians here in these situations. And again, this is just one example of how Indians resisted. In Florida, the Seminole Indians, just kind of as a footnote here, because of geography of Florida, the swamps and the Everglades. A lot of the Seminole Indians had lived in this area for centuries. This area is not very hospitable, not very well suited for warfare, so the federal troops were never able to fully remove the Seminole Indians from Florida. And the Seminoles were able to maintain effective resistance, aided by geography, for many years, well into the 1840s, when finally the federal government just abandoned any attempts to remove them. So some Indians are able to resist this, most are not, and most will end up removed to the western frontier. One other controversy that characterized Jackson's first term in office is this nullification crisis. And this is going on at the same time as Indian Removal. Indian Removal Act is passed in 1830, but the process of removing them takes several years. So while that process of Indian removal is ongoing, another crisis erupts over the tariff. Remember, a tariff, our tax on imports. We talked about how Southerners viewed the tariff as giving an unfair advantage to the Northern business interest at the expense of the Southern economy. So the arguments against the tariff haven't really changed, but it's going to reach crisis proportions in the year 1832 as South Carolina becomes more openly defiant of this federal tariff, this tax on imports. At the center of this debate is states' rights. South Carolina specifically, or South Carolina is kind of the squeaky wheel here. And this sentiment is shared by all of the southern states, but South Carolina is the most vocal about it. So this is why our story is going to center on what happens in South Carolina. So the issue of states' rights, and if you remember our discussion of the Constitution, we talked about the 10th Amendment, which states specifically that anything not specified in the Constitution as a federal power is automatically reserved for the discretion of the states. So this 10th Amendment protects the rights of the states to govern themselves in the absence of specific federal powers. So with things like the tariff, South Carolina and of course other southern states are arguing that the federal government is abusing its power. While the Constitution does provide the federal government authority to levy taxes, it doesn't say anything specifically about tariffs. So Southerners view this as an abuse of federal power, particularly because the tariff tends to benefit only northern industries. And remember, that's the purpose of a tariff, is to protect domestic industry. So since all the industries are in the north, this tariff kind of gives one region of the nation an advantage that the other region doesn't have. So the South sees it as oppressive, an abuse of federal power. Another aspect of states' rights that kind of intersects with this here is the issue of slavery. One of the reasons why Southerners were so protective of their states' rights was the institution of slavery was very important to the South. It's the foundation of their entire economy. Even in the 1830s, at this time, we're still 20 years, 30 years away from the Civil War, 25, 30 years away. Slavery is still an essential part of the Southern economy. Almost all of the work being done in the South is being done by slave labor, or the big money-making crops like cotton. All that is being done by slave labor. Now, of course, there are still numerous small family farms where no slaves at all work, but none of those farms are really integral to the Southern economy. So we're talking about money and power here. Money and power controlled by the Southern elite. And so it's these people who are so concerned about the state's rights. The state's right to decide for itself whether or not they're going to have slaves. And this is an important issue from the Southern perspective. And Southerners are concerned that if the federal government is allowed to abuse its power continually in issues like the tariff, then eventually the federal government might take measures to abolish slavery. Keep in mind the abolitionist movement, which we'll be talking about here in a week or two. The abolitionist movement has already begun to take shape in the background during this time frame. So there's growing support for the abolishment of slavery. And of course, this is all in the North, obviously. But members of Congress from the North are representing the people of the North who are now actively trying to dismantle the institution of slavery. So from the Southern perspective, there is great concern that Congress may begin to act on this abolitionist movement. If Congress is allowed to exercise undue power, then they may decide to pass laws abolishing slavery. So states' rights is still at the heart of this issue. Tariffs and slavery. And one of the reasons why slavery kind of comes up again as an issue at this particular time is that right before this crisis boils over, there was a minor slave uprising in Virginia in 1831. So the year prior to this, a slave uprising kind of rekindled Southerners' fear of slave uprisings, especially those that appear to be instigated by Northern abolitionists. And that was the case with this Nat Turner revolt. A lot of Southerners viewed this as being the result of Northern abolitionist interests trying to stir up trouble in the South. And of course, the timing here is important. Even if there's no direct connection between two events, if they happen in a similar time frame, human nature has a tendency to connect these events in ways that they are not actually connected. So the issue of slavery and Northern abolitionists' attempt to get rid of slavery, rekindling these fears right about the same time that South Carolina is particularly upset over this tariff. The two issues tend to be rolled up into one big issue of states' rights. So this is the stage, how the stage is set in 1832 for this crisis. And it's one of those things that it starts out with an existing issue. Protest over the tariff is not new in 1832. It's just being rekindled, and it's reaching crisis proportions. The way this whole thing gets started is that the most vocal voices in the South are the people who benefit the most from plantation agriculture. The people who hold the money, the people who hold all the power, Southern political and economic elites. These are the most vocal voices here. You don't hear so much of this murmuring in the lower parts of Southern society. This is mainly our Southern congressmen and the people who hold power in the South. People like John Calhoun, who is currently the vice president under Andrew Jackson, and a senator from South Carolina, Robert Barnwell Rhett. These are the two most prominent voices in this issue. Now, Calhoun has long been an opponent of the tariff, and he's made no secrets about it, other than his anonymous essay, the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. We talked about that in the last session, how Calhoun is attempting to give voice to this protest over the tariff. Calhoun's reference to nullification and secession in this essay, both kind of somewhat radical ideas. These ideas help fuel people who are more radical, like Robert Rhett, the senator from South Carolina. He is very radical, and Rhett represents kind of a minority, a growing minority among Southerners that are radically speaking out against these issues, against the federal government. Rhett, he's a strong supporter of secession. Rhett and people like him advocate secession as the only viable alternative to protecting Southern rights. In the minds of people like Rhett, There's no sense discussing this with the federal government anymore. There's not going to be any resolution. The only way to protect Southern interests is to secede. Calhoun represents the more moderate voices. Even though Calhoun himself had indicated that secession might be an option, typically Calhoun represents the moderate Southern voices. He's talking about nullification as a way to protect Southern rights from the abuse of federal power. So while Calhoun and Rhett represent various degrees of this spectrum, they both can agree that if the federal government is allowed to continue exercising undue power, abusing its power, imposing unfair restrictions on the South, then that allows the door to be open to further abuses. And if it continues, then one day, worst case scenario, the federal government could pass a law abolishing slavery. So this is one of the reasons why Southerners are so determined to take a strong states' rights position here, is because they don't want to allow even the slightest abuse of the federal government or federal power, because they believe that will kind of set a precedent for the future, and the federal government will continue abusing its power until all Southern rights have been stripped away. So Calhoun, a more moderate voice, Rhett, a more radical voice, both advocating similar ideas, protection of Southern rights, with ideas of nullification advocated by Calhoun and secession advocated by Rhett. So again, the main center of their argument is that a powerful federal government, the very existence of a powerful federal government, is essentially a threat to Southern liberty and property. And that nullification and secession are both alternatives to a powerful federal government. This is the way that Southerners are going to, this is the only way that Southerners are going to be able to protect their rights, is through these two ideas. So in 1832, these ideas have gained enough support to where there's somewhat of a movement growing in South Carolina. In fact, what ends up happening is that in 1832, as this whole thing begins to boil over and become more tense, John C. Calhoun kind of is faced with a choice here. He has to decide where his loyalties lie. Calhoun is currently serving as a vice president for Andrew Jackson, but Calhoun has strong ties to his state of South Carolina. So in the end, Calhoun is going to side with South Carolina. He's going to side with his home state. He will resign as vice president and go back to serve in his state government. Again, he's having to choose here where his loyalties lie, and he takes a position against the federal government and chooses to side with his state. South Carolina passes a resolution in 1832, basically nullifying this tariff, and this happens right at about a time where Andrew Jackson, as president, he's attempting to play the role of peacemaker here. Jackson traditionally has been a states' rights advocate. At his core, when he campaigned for office, he ran on a platform of states' rights, ridding the government of this perceived corruption, placing more emphasis on the rights of the states, preventing the federal government from abusing its power. So Jackson traditionally supports state rights, but he's still a nationalist, and as president, he has a duty to try and protect the Union, to keep the nation intact, to find some way of resolving this issue without states seceding or defying federal law. So Jackson encourages Congress to pass a revised tariff in 1832. Basically, what this 1832 tariff does is it lowers the current tariff, the one passed in 1828, that tariff of abominations. It takes that tariff, which was 50%, and it lowers it down to 37%. So this tariff of 1832 now at 37% tax on imports. This is Jackson attempting to try to offer an olive branch to South Carolina. He's like, hey, I get it. I support states' rights. I understand your all's argument. Tariff gives an advantage to one section of the country at the expense of the other, but we can't just get rid of it. Here I'm offering to have it lowered as an attempt to ease this tension. But South Carolina at this point has become so entrenched in their own position that they're unwilling to listen to Jackson's proposal here. And South Carolina state government passes a resolution that nullifies both the tariff of 1828 and the one of 1832, this new 37% tariff. So basically South Carolina state government nullifies all tariffs, basically saying that no tax on imports will be collected by the state of South Carolina. Basically offering, so if any foreign country wants to import goods into South Carolina, no tax will be collected. The tariff has been nullified in South Carolina. Now, basically, this is what really sets off, this is the spark that kind of sets off this whole crisis. Up to this point, it has just been a debate. South Carolina debating or protesting the tariff. The federal government, of course, led by Andrew Jackson, attempting to try and negotiate or make peace with South Carolina, try to ease the tension somewhat. But South Carolina finally striking the last blow here, setting the spark that sets off this crisis. And the word crisis could not be more appropriate, because the situation escalates almost to the point of civil war over this issue of the tariff. And this is one of the reasons why I spent so long a few days ago discussing Andrew Jackson's background. Some of his life experiences that shaped him and formed him into the person that he is as an adult. Those things are important. Who he is as a person is important, because this is going to influence how he responds in these various crises. We talked about his unsympathetic view toward the Indians. A lot of that's based on his time spent on the frontier. A lot of his adult life was spent fighting Indians on the frontier. He has no sympathy for the Indians at all, which is partially explains his harsh position against them. In this crisis, this nullification crisis, in 1832, Jackson is going to take a similarly harsh response to this. Now, while Jackson is somewhat sympathetic to South Carolina's issues here, the bottom line is that he supports the Union, and he's not going to stand for any state standing up and defying federal law. Plus, too, Jackson kind of takes this personally, since he was the one who kind of orchestrated that 37%, the reduced tariff in 1832, and South Carolina's open rejection of this olive branch that he had offered. Jackson takes this personally, and Jackson, being the man he is, he's not about to back down from a fight, especially once he starts to personalize this issue. He's going to dig his heels in, and he is not going to back down at all. And we talked about Jackson the man, how he fought duels, he fought Indians, he almost beat a would-be assassin to death. Even as a young boy, he stood up in defiance of a British officer who was threatening to kill him. So this is not a guy who backs down from any kind of a fight. And Jackson now is in fight mode, and he's gonna push this all the way to the limit. So Jackson approaches Congress once South Carolina has indicated that their unwillingness to accept even the slightest concessions. Jackson approaches Congress and asks for Congress to pass the Force Act. This is in 1833, so this has been going on for several months now. We're into the next year. Jackson asks Congress to pass this Force Act, basically authorizing the president to use the military to enforce federal law. So this Force Act is going to give the president wide latitude here in how he responds to this South Carolina defiance. But if any other president was in this situation, or any other president up to this point, not a lot of people would be overly concerned. But because it's Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson has a reputation of not making idle threats, he's a man of action. He's a man who will not back down from a fight, especially if he believes that he's in the right. There's a genuine fear among many people, especially in Congress, that a civil war, the nation is on the brink of a civil war, because once South Carolina has taken this hard stand by nullifying these federal laws, at and especially threatening to secede, people, radicals like Robert Rhett, who were threatening secession, and of course Calhoun, Jackson's vice president, resigning as part of this protest. South Carolina is not going to back down. Jackson is not going to back down, and there's a genuine fear among many people in the nation that civil war is imminent. Federal troops are being activated. Jackson is assembling an army, preparing to march into South Carolina. South Carolina state government is calling up its militia. People on both sides are preparing for war here. And at the heart of it is this issue of state power versus federal power. To what extent can a state resist federal authority? In the opinion of Calhoun and Rhett, secession and nullification are acceptable methods of resisting federal authority. From Andrew Jackson's perspective, a state cannot defy federal authority. The states are subordinate to the federal government. In fact, Jackson gets very belligerent here. Jackson at one point issues an open threat. Once Congress passes the Force Act, Jackson makes a public statement saying, if South Carolina sheds one drop of blood, that I will hang the first one of them that I find to the first tree that I find. Here Jackson is speaking very aggressively. He's threatening to use force, and when somebody like Jackson threatens to use force, basically people start preparing for war. So this is not an idle threat. Jackson fully intends on marching federal troops into South Carolina and forcing them to comply with this tariff. If that happens, if Jackson is pushed to the limit here, if he is backed into a corner and he believes he has no alternative but to march troops into South Carolina, war is gonna start, because South Carolina will see that as proof of federal oppression of their states' rights. Other southern states will probably join in, and at that point we'll be past the point of no return. And it's at this moment where the crisis is at its height that our old friend Henry Clay steps up and offers up this compromise tariff of 1833. Now, Henry Clay has already made himself a reputation of being the great compromiser. Of course, they didn't really refer to him as this during his time. Later historians referred to Clay as the great compromiser, because on numerous occasions Clay, in a moment of crisis, comes up with an idea that appears to settle the dispute. Remember, we talked about a few sessions ago the Missouri Compromise, the similar crisis over the states' rights in the case of Missouri's statehood. Henry Clay at that point offered up this Missouri Compromise, which allowed both sides of the issue to kind of agree on a course of action and move forward. This compromise tariff of 1833 is going to function in the same way. Henry Clay proposes that we take the existing tariff, this 37% tariff that Congress just passed, and we lower it an additional 20% over the next 10 years. So basically what this is going to do is gradually over the next 10 years, the current tariff will be lowered down to its original percentage that it was back in 1816. So it's not an immediate relief from this tariff that South Carolina is protesting, but it is gradual reduction back to its original level over the next 10 years. What this does is it allows both sides a chance to back down with some dignity. If South Carolina just backs down in the face of Andrew Jackson's threat of force, it makes them look weak. They're bowing to federal abuse of power. If Jackson backs down, it sends a message that any state can defy the federal government and there aren't any consequences. So this compromise tariff allows both sides to back down without losing face and retain some dignity. All sides agree that, okay, South Carolina doesn't change its opinion over the tariffs. They still are opposed to tariffs because they still think they're unfair. And there's a legitimate argument there. But there's also a legitimate argument that those northern industries need these tariffs in order to compete with British imports. So here, this gradual reduction over a period of 10 years allows both sides to have something. Northern businesses get some protection against imports over the next few years, and Southerners get gradual relief from these tariffs over the same period. So both sides end up getting a little bit here, neither side getting everything they want, but that's the definition of a compromise, is that both sides give a little in order to get a little. When this tariff is approved by Congress, South Carolina finally backs down. They back down for a couple of different reasons. One, they agree that this new compromise tariff is not an ideal solution, but it is something is better than nothing. One of the real reasons that South Carolina is forced to back down here is that they realize they're in a position, they're out on a limb here. They've made some bold statements that said, we nullify this tariff and we're willing to secede from the Union in order to see this through. Now, South Carolina doesn't have a lot of support from the other southern states. Now, every southern state agrees with South Carolina that the tariff is unfair. They all support South Carolina in that respect. But when South Carolina threatens secession and they openly defy the federal government and express their willingness to fight a war in order to protect their position on this issue, the other southern states kind of back away. They're like, okay, we agree that the tariff is unfair, but we're not willing to go to war over it, at least not yet. But none of the other southern states were willing to stand with South Carolina and face possible war with the federal government over this issue of the tariff. Other southern states are like, if we're going to go to war over something, let it be for something big and not this issue of the tariff. So South Carolina's kind of out on a limb by themselves here. They know that they can't really maintain this position indefinitely. So this is part of what encourages South Carolina to back down. And eventually, over the next few months, once the dust settles, South Carolina will officially, within their state government, they'll rescind their nullification of the tariff. What's kind of a funny little footnote here is that once South Carolina rescinds their nullification of the tariff, as an attempt to kind of assert their position and maybe kind of as a passive-aggressive example of defiance, South Carolina votes to nullify the Force Act. Now, since they'd already backed down, the Force Act is kind of irrelevant. The Force Act just gave the president temporary power to invade South Carolina if he needed to, but there's no need to now, so the Force Act is irrelevant. So South Carolina's nullification of the Force Act is just kind of a hollow or symbolic gesture, them trying to get the last word in. It's just kind of amusing. But the dust settles and the issue passes. But in much the same case as the Missouri crisis, this nullification crisis, even though the compromise tariff allowed the situation, kind of diffused the situation, it doesn't do anything to resolve the underlying issues. Just like the Missouri Compromise, it averted a crisis over Missouri statehood, but it didn't really address the underlying issues. And those issues will continue to fester, and the same is true here with this nullification crisis. Compromise tariff diffused the immediate crisis, but the core issues that Southern determination to protect states' rights. The federal government's determination to assert its dominance over the states. These issues never go away. What happens as a result, though, the end consequences of this nullification crisis. No federal troops set foot into South Carolina. No shots were fired. No battles were fought. That whole crisis was averted. But South Carolina learns an important lesson. South Carolina, after this crisis, South Carolina especially becomes more radical. Southern states in general, but South Carolina especially. And they come to see secession as the only real way to protect their interests, their state rights. Things like their right to decide over the tariff, their rights to decide whether or not to have the institution of slavery. They see secession as the only viable alternative. Now, they're not in a position to make good on this threat, so they kind of back down. But South Carolina learns too that it can't fight this fight on its own. It's not strong enough to stand up to the federal government by itself. It needs the support of the entire South in order to make good on these threats. So starting in 1833, South Carolina begins to build a consensus among southern states, try to generate support for this strong states' rights position, and it also begins to advocate the idea of secession as an option. Let's put secession on the table. We're not going to do it now. We may not ever have to do it, but let's keep it on the table as an option for protecting our states' rights. So South Carolina especially becomes more radical in the years that follow this nullification crisis. Other states in the South will also become increasingly radical, never to the extent of South Carolina, but the South as a whole begins moving in this direction, this strong determination to protect states' rights, even at the expense of seceding from the Union if necessary. So what happens too is that a lot of Southern Democrats are going to leave the Democratic Party. Keep in mind, Andrew Jackson is kind of the leader of the current Democratic Party here in the 1830s. A lot of Southern Democrats, in their opposition to Jackson here, who they see as kind of a betrayer. Jackson's from the South. He should have stood with the South. He claimed to be an advocate of states' rights. He should have been on South Carolina's side here, and they kind of resent Andrew Jackson after this whole nullification crisis because they see him as betraying his own kind in favor of the federal government, which isn't true, but again, perceptions are important. And many Southern Democrats perceive Andrew Jackson to be a betrayer, so a lot of them leave the Democratic Party and they'll begin to form a new anti-Jackson party. And we'll talk about that in the next session, how growing opposition to Andrew Jackson, not just among Southerners, but among various groups in the nation, will lead to the creation of a new anti-Jackson party. That's where we'll pick it up next session. So until then, take care.